Hello, I'm Juliette Morris. Today on Scenes of Crime, 2 crimes committed in the name of love. Later we'll be visiting a seaside villa in Bournemouth where, in 1933, an illicit love affair ended in murder and suicide. But first to Peasenhall in Suffolk, where a young servant girl met an awful death, for which no one has ever been brought to book. The pretty village of Peasenhall in Suffolk guards a sad secret. In 1902, Providence House in the main street was witness to an intriguing romance and an unsolved murder mystery that's been the subject of investigation for nearly a century.
You've got to remember today that the Providence House is still a family home. It's the murder that put Peasenhall on the map. People still visit Peasenhall today. If you go in the local restaurant, they've got the newspaper headlines of that particular incident on display. So the whole community still has an ongoing mystery, and as I say, today still unsolved.
The woman at the centre of the Peasenhall mystery was 22-year-old Rose Harsent. She was the live-in domestic servant at Providence House, working for the local Baptist elder, Deacon Chris.
I think for the time, the Edwardian era, Rose Harsent was, I guess, racy and high-spirited is what we might call them now. She enjoyed the bawdy company of the local lads, enjoyed a dirty joke and what we'd consider today as rugby songs. She was the belle of the village.
Right, here we are now standing outside what was Providence House and is now known as Stewart House, the scene of the murder. This was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Crisp, and Rose Harsent was employed as a domestic servant. She had a room of her own which was situated directly above the Crisps' bedroom at the front of the house, and of course the murder was committed in the kitchen at the rear of the house. She had a separate staircase leading down from her loft room at the far end of the roof, which took her directly into the kitchen where the murder occurred.
There was another pillar of the community who knew Rose. William Gardner, also a prominent religious figure, was a hard-working family man who'd risen from labourer to foreman at the Peasenhall seed drill works.
William Gardner was a cross between he looks like a Spaniard or a Russian spy with a big dark bushy beard. He was supervisor at the local seed drill works, which was the main employer in the area at the time, although he was a trained wheelwright and carpenter. He was a leading figure in the community, in the Primitive Methodist Church. He was a superintendent, treasurer and trustee of the local Sunday school, and he was also the choir master.
Like Gardner, Rose Harsent was a follower of Primitive Methodism, a back-to-basics movement popular among the working classes at the time. Her closeness to Gardner erupted in a scandal that centred on the secluded building known as the Doctor's Chapel.
Okay, here we have the footpath that leads up to the Doctor's Chapel, which is where William Gardner and Rose Harsent used to meet. Just across the road at the bottom here we had Smythe's Drill Works, and in fact in the wall down there you can still see the bricked up doorway that Gardner would leave his office from. He would then just come up this path to the Doctor's Chapel a few yards up the path here, where he'd meet Rose Harsent. In those days there was a high hedge down either side and it was very difficult to see anybody up here, so it was an ideal place for them to meet and conduct their liaison in private.
Rose and Gardner were seen together at their love nest by 2 young men, George Wright and Alfonso Skinner. They lost no time in spreading the gossip.
This spot here would be where the 2 youths were hiding and listening and watching, and this was the window inside which Gardner and Rose Harsent were carrying on. There was a bench just inside the window and they were on that bench just inside. There are hoppers, as you can see, along this wall, which were air vents, and in fact they were along both walls, as I said at the time, and it was through these that the voices were supposed to carry so that people outside could hear what was being said, and through which Wright and Skinner claimed they could hear the conversation inside.
Well, did they or didn't they? That's always the question. I mean, it was really had the elements of an Edwardian soap opera, which was why it was still a scandal a year later on in the village. In the spring, May the 31st, Rose received an unsigned letter of assignation, but I think it was very clear that she knew who it was from.
This was the last letter that Rose Harsent would ever receive.
I will try and see you tonight at 12 o'clock at your place, if you put a light in your window at 10 o'clock for about 10 minutes.
For about 10 minutes. Then you can take it out again. Don't have a light in the window at 12, as I will come round the back.
The candle would have been easily visible from Gardner's cottage, which was about 200 yards down the main street. Rose would have come down the staircase into the kitchen, and there was a door with a Suffolk latch immediately at the bottom of the stairs leading into the kitchen, which was a very small kitchen, had a table in the middle of the room and a range at one side. And she was murdered on the outer side of the room to the house, to the front of the house that is, and she was laying next to the table with her head resting at the bottom of the staircase and her feet towards the back door, and her body was found the next morning by her father, who entered the kitchen and was confronted by the body of his daughter lying on her back on the floor with the throat cut and the nightdress all charred, where an attempt had been made to burn the body.
No shortage of clues. The fire was started with the local paper, the East Anglian Daily Times. Now, Rose and her employer, they didn't take the paper, but we know that William Gardner did. There was a broken medicine bottle containing paraffin, which had been prescribed to Mrs. Gardner's children.
2 days after the body was found, William Gardner was arrested for murder.
The post-mortem revealed Rose was 6 months pregnant, and it was believed that the murderer was the father of the child, but we don't know who that was. It could have been that attempts had been made to get rid of the baby, which failed, and there was a fight, and it ended in murder.
It was made to look as though she tripped on the stairs and cut herself actually with the oil lamp. There was an attempt to set light to the body, or at least to char it, to make it look as though there had been an accident with an oil lamp, and she had been cut by the glass of the oil lamp and burnt by the burning oil.
Well, what's interesting about this case is that William Gardner was tried twice, and each time the jury failed to come up with a verdict. They were going to prosecute for the third time, but the Crown never pursued that. Now, you've got to remember that it was a small village community, gossip, and I think the sheer pressure within the community was unbearable for the family, and they were forced to leave.
Even the weather is said to have been affected by the mystery. Legend has it that every 7 years, on the anniversary of the murder, a violent thunderstorm erupts.
I don't believe it at all. We've been here for 14 years. If there were to have been a thunderstorm every 7 years, as is rumoured on the night of the 31st of May, we would have suffered at least 2 of those thunderstorms in that 14 years. To the best of our knowledge, we have the same thunderstorms as everybody else has in this area.
In her final resting place in a cemetery above the village, Rose is commemorated with these words: "In affectionate remembrance of Rose Ann Harsent, whose life was cruelly taken on the 1st of June, 1902. Her bereaved family never saw her killer brought to justice, and Peasenhall still guards its secret." In Peasenhall, passion seemed to boil over into violence. In a moment on Scenes of Crime, we'll see how another passionate affair had tragic consequences for 3 people. Welcome back. I'm Juliette Morris. It was one of the most scandalous murders in British history, a tale of passion and intrigue, and it all happened at a genteel British seaside resort. Bournemouth, on the English Riviera. Its elegant streets are well known as a haven for well-off pensioners. But in the 1930s, Bournemouth became the unexpected setting for a violent crime of passion. It took place at a house called the Villa Madeira, where a love triangle exploded into murder. One local journalist who's explored the case in depth is Roger Guttridge.
It is a well-remembered story in that it is one of the great classic murders of the 20th century.
The story begins in Canada with the marriage of Francis Rattenbury to a much younger woman, Alma.
Alma and Francis Rattenbury were quite an unusual and remarkable couple, and a particularly interesting couple. There was about 30 years difference in their age, but they were also an accomplished couple independently in their own right. He as an architect, she as a musician. Things didn't run too smoothly because, of course, in those days, the age gap between them, she in her 20s, he in his 50s or early 60s by then, it caused a bit of a scandal, really. And after a while, they decided to pack their bags and head for England and start again there.
They came to Bournemouth and rented a house in Manor Road, where they lived with their two sons, Christopher and John. Villa Madeira is now owned by Valerie and David Goldsmith, who recently inherited it from Valerie's aunt.
When she moved in, she heard the decorators talking to each other, and one said, "Oh, I hope they've mopped up all the blood." And of course my aunt knew nothing about this, and she said, "Well, why? Have you hurt yourself? Do you want a plaster?" And they said, "Well, did you not know the story of the house?" She said, "What story?" And of course, that's how it all came about.
But the move to the Villa Madeira didn't solve the Rattenbury problems.
They were possibly happy for a while, but if they were, then it didn't last. The age gap obviously was taking its toll. Alma was actually a very highly sexed woman, so they say, and of course her husband by now was in his mid to late 60s, and he told her to make arrangements elsewhere, and that apparently is what she did.
After a time, I think she must have got frustrated sexually, and he was drinking quite a lot. So I don't know the reason why, but she advertised for a scout-trained gardener in the local paper.
In 1934, 4 years after the Rattenburys' arrival in Bournemouth, George Percy Stoner was appointed as general handyman and chauffeur. But the duties expected of him didn't end there.
One or two other applicants applied, but I think were deterred by Alma's sexual advances and innuendos. And in fact, she had already driven away one or two other servants that had been employed. Within 2 months of Stoner taking up his employment, Alma seduced him, and then arrangements were made for him to move into the Villa Madeira.
Here we are. I thought we'd start at the top of the house. So we'll take you into the bedroom of George Percy Stoner, the gardener. Gardener come chauffeur, and this is where he slept. This was his bedroom. So coming out of Stoner's bedroom, this was the bedroom of Irene Riggs. This is where she slept. Now she was the companion to Alma, and she also served as a maid as well and helped out in the house. So George Stoner would have come past Irene Riggs's bedroom to get to Alma's bedroom, which was this one here, the main bedroom.
The walls could probably tell a story from those days, because I think quite a lot went on in this room.
Little John was sleeping in this room with them when Stoner used to come and visit Alma in the night. And little John was asleep in his bed. I think that shocked many people.
Meanwhile, Francis kept out of their way.
And this room here, this is where Francis Rattenbury slept. This is right next door to the lounge.
Where he could come from the lounge after drinking, heavily drinking at night, and just walking, stumbling here.
The cosy setup at Villa Madeira might have continued indefinitely if Alma hadn't taken Stoner on a 4-day trip to London. There she lavished money on him, staying at the Royal Palace Hotel in Kensington and shopping at Harrods.
They went on a shopping spree. She bought him a suit, shoes, shirts, and a pair of the best silk pyjamas at 60 shillings. But this relationship with a woman twice his age seemed to go to his head, and he became even threatening and violent on occasions, and also insanely jealous.
When the pair returned to Villa Madeira, life began to change. Things came to a head when Alma suggested to Francis that they go to Bridport to visit a business associate called Mr. Jenks.
Stoner seems to have overheard the conversation, and he suddenly became very annoyed about it and refused to drive the chauffeur-driven car. It seems that although there were no apparent relations between Alma and Francis Rattenbury, even the prospect of them sharing a room was enough, apparently, to make Stoner jealous.
The night before the trip, the 24th of March 1935, seemed like a normal evening in Villa Madeira. Alma went to bed at 9:30, leaving Francis to his whiskey.
That night when Stoner went into Alma's room, he told her that he'd hurt rats. At first she took no notice, but then she heard her husband groaning.
This is where Mr. Rattenbury sat, just here, and George Stoner came through the French windows here, holding a mallet, and he would have hit him here. And I imagine he would have got up because he fell to the floor.
Probably fell down here.
Alma came down and found quite a pool of blood. His head was lying in the blood and his teeth were out.
She actually trod on his false teeth, which is rather bizarre, but that made her hysterical.
Both the police and the doctor were called. When they arrived at Villa Madeira, they found Alma in quite a state.
She'd been drinking heavily. She was contradicting herself and rambling, but from time to time she would indicate that she in fact had committed the crime.
Francis Rattenbury, who was badly injured but still alive, was taken to a nearby hospital. Alma was arrested and sent to Holloway Prison.
An air of gloom settled over the house at the Villa Madeira, and it was during this period, the following day, that Stoner confessed to Irene Riggs, the lady helper of the house, that he had in fact hit Francis Rattenbury with a mallet. And he said he'd done so because he had seen Alma and Francis making love in Francis's room the night before the visit to Bridport. One should explain perhaps that making love in the 1930s didn't mean quite what it does today. I think it was probably more of an affectionate kiss or something of that kind.
Stoner was duly arrested, and when Francis Rattenbury died a few days later, the adulterous pair were charged with murder. Their trial began at the Old Bailey on the 27th of May 1935. Alma retracted her confession. Stoner instructed his counsel to say that he'd struck the fatal blows. On the fifth day, the jury returned their verdict. Alma was found not guilty. Stoner was sentenced to death.
It has been known ever since as a cause célèbre, one of the great scandal murders of the 20th century, internationally, not just in Britain. But by and large, the public sympathy was very much with Stoner. People saw him, I think, as the relatively innocent victim of this affair.
Seen as the temptress, Alma was riven by guilt. 3 days after the verdict, she boarded a train at London, got off at Christchurch, and walked to a point on the River Avon, known as the Three Arches Bend.
And there she sat down in the buttercups and scribbled some last notes about how desperate she felt, how tragically things had gone wrong, and it's quite clear from those what a dreadful state she was in. After all, her husband was dead, her lover was now facing execution, and she felt responsible for that, and she was in disgrace as far as the public were concerned, and obviously her children came into her thoughts as well. And having written those last few words, she then, watched from a distance by a farm worker, stood up on the bank of the river and plunged a knife 6 times into her chest and committed suicide.
But with tragic irony, shortly afterwards, Stoner's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He served just 7 years until he was released in 1942. He joined the army and took part in the Normandy landings. For months, coach parties came to Gorp at the Villa Madeira, but what really happened there that night still retains an air of mystery.
It has been suggested since that maybe Stoner didn't do it at all, and that he might, there might be another story waiting to come out, but I don't personally think that's the case. I think it's fairly clear that Stoner committed this murder, and also that he was insanely and unreasonably jealous. But it emerged a few years ago that he may well have overheard a conversation on the night before the proposed trip to Bridport, in which Francis Rattenbury was urging his wife to make advances to or seduce or have an affair with Mr. Jenks, in order to encourage him, shall we say, to finance the building project which he wanted him to be involved in. That Stoner had overheard this, and faced with the prospect of Alma having to have an affair with this other gentleman, he became even more jealous than usual, and dealt with Rattenbury accordingly.
Maybe there's another story lurking here, if only walls could talk. But one thing seems certain. The house will always carry the ghost of Francis Rattenbury.
I think you feel a very deep loneliness in this house. You do hear things, but probably you hear what you want to hear. I don't know, but I still think that the house has a sadness about it. I don't know, just not a frightening, more of a sadness I pick up than anything.
So, Villa Madeira refused to reveal all its secrets. Join us again for more mysteries on Scenes of Crime.